Good afternoon, guys. I thought I would come to you today with a tier list for the Rise of Ix leaders. Now, if it were up to me, I would remake a new version of this with the Bloodlines leaders, which are new, but I think it's okay. I don't have a lot of experience with them yet. I've only played 3 or 4 Bloodline leaders, usually just once, so I don't have a ton of experience. So we'll just make this one, the leaders with that I actually have expertise to speak on. Everyone kind of knows where balance falls, but I think it's going to be interesting in the middle, where you're kind of debating between the known picks. So let's go ahead and start at the top. The best leader in Dune Imperium, Rise of Ix, is Tessia Vernius. Tessia is the strongest leader in the game. It's not super close. The next guy can compete with her and is kind of similar, but she is still stronger than him. The thing that's important about Tessia is that when you look at what certain leaders need to do to win the game, the bar for Tessia is just a lot lower than everybody else. For Armand to win, he's got to get really good cards. He's got to trash his deck down. He's got to recur those cards. He's got to build this whole engine, right? If you want to win with Ilban, you've got to get like a Holtzman engine. You've got to get a bunch of spice must flows. Maybe do some deck building. Maybe do some combat. Memnon, you got to get High Council, or you should get High Council a lot of the games, and you got to find a use for your spice and all these other things. And Tessia doesn't have to do anything, really. Tessia just basically gets 2 faction bumps, some spice, and a couple resources, essentially, for free just by existing. And she gets so much flexibility with those faction bumps in a way that's very relevant, particularly for Rise of Ix, because she pretty much can't be locked out of the Spacing Guild track. She's always competitive on the Spacing Guild track and is going to finish games very, very quickly. Tessia is strong in every position because of the way that her ring works. She can, be first position, go fold space, then, go to still suits, and then move the influence from still suits over to guild with her ring, and then she still has what she needs to get to interstellar shipping, even though she was in first position. Something is similarly true with fourth position. Fourth is a little harder for her because she's unlikely to get 2 bumps with the guild. But any of the first 3 positions, she's very strong, and even third, she can often make work. She steals alliances very proficiently. She can really do just about anything. You can win the game with Tessia with an empty deck, essentially, and by empty I mean you didn't buy any useful cards. Maybe you bought a liaison. Maybe you bought, I don't know, a space travel or some, 3 or 4 cost card or 2 or 3 cost card, and that's it. Just because her starting deck is enough to win her the game, essentially. So she can completely ignore the deck building aspect of the game, and still win. I have 100% win rate with Tessia. I've never lost with her, but that's only because I've played her 2 times. I don't find her very interesting. Steersman Yarkun in the new expansion is basically a fixed version of Tessia. I think that he is a lot more interesting, and I'm considering just taking Tessia out of my game copy and replacing her with Steersman, who I consider to be a patched version of the leader. If I had to put Steersman somewhere, I would probably put him in Mentat tier, which I don't have a ton of experience with him. I've seen him in maybe 3 games total, and he's always done pretty okay. So it's hard for me to say exactly where he lies. I just don't have enough data yet. But that's kind of how I feel about that. So Tessie is done. Now we're going to talk about the next leader, which is Baron Harkonnen. The Baron has been, if you look at the competitive history of Dune Imperium, since the very base game, since the original base game copy, every iteration of Dune Imperium, Baron Harkonnen has been one of the best leaders. Tessia is a newer leader, so she doesn't have as much, new in a very relative sense, but she doesn't have as much of a legacy, but Baron has always been very, very strong. The most obvious reason for this is that that Masterstroke is just, it's a very, very quick 2 faction bumps. That's equivalent to about a point. If you end up with alliances, it's worth more than that. It allows you to just get the game going very quickly and start putting your opponents on the defense. It helps you because you can snowball early combat victories as well. And then also his signet ring, I think, is an underrated aspect of his power. Intrigue cards are one of the most powerful things in the game. Frequently, intrigue cards will just give you points, right? You'll draw machine culture when you already had 3 technologies, or you'll draw a corner of the market when you already had 2 spice must flows, or whatever else. And combat intrigues can win you 2+ points. So the Baron's ability to get more intrigue cards than any other leader in the game, I think, really also cements his spot in the top tier here. He's not as good as Tessia, because Baron actually does have to make things work. And the other thing that puts him in this tier, and I think the thing that you see these 2 Kwisatz Haderach tier leaders have in common, is that they both have ways to essentially always get to interstellar shipping, right? If Baron is in the first 2 positions, or sometimes 3 positions, he can pretty much guaranteed always get to interstellar if he wants it. And it's a really, really powerful space, and the game is balanced when multiple people are vying for that center of gravity. And when one person monopolizes it, it's not balanced. So that's why Tessia and Baron stood at the highest tier here. I actually will say, I think Baron is a fun leader. I think unlike Tessia, he is well designed and he is interesting. It's fun to play Baron, to get all these intrigue cards. The hidden factions are cool, although Rise of Ix has a game design flaw where the hidden factions are not actually hidden at all, because your factions are Fremen and Guild always, every time, unless Firm Grip is in the row or something. So that's a little unfortunate. Now, that's not a flaw with the Baron, that's just a flaw with the way that Rise of Ix works. And if you play Baron with Uprising, you're not going to experience that issue. But in general, I think this is a fun leader that is also strong, and he's okay. Whereas Tessia is a really, really strong leader that makes a lot of games not games, because if I'm playing a game and it's me plus a Ariana and Ilban and Tessia, I'm going to say this is a 2-player game. It's me and Tessia, because the other players have no shot because there's a Tessia. So I should do things that are zero-sum to hurt Tessia, because she's the person that's going to beat me if I lose this game. Now that can change based on who's playing who, but Baron's not like that. Baron is a strong leader, but ultimately you can beat him. Although when he high rolls higher than Tessia. Sometimes Barons will end the game in round 6 before even a round 2 combat comes out. I've seen it happen where they just get so many points so quickly that it's just over. And those games are not fun, and those games are not very interactable, but those don't happen very often. Those are maybe 1 in 10 games that the Baron participates in. So I'm not too worried about that. Now we go on to Reverend Mother tier. I think these 2 clearly sit in a tier higher above everybody else. But if we move down to Reverend Mother, we get to just the good leaders. I think the one that sort of is most obvious here is Duke Leto. You're going to see a pattern here. The top leaders all have ways to steal, compete, race alliances. And Leto's no exception. Leto's just good at everything. He's not as good at everything as the 2 above him, but he can do combat with Dreadnoughts. He can do deck building with Mentad and High Council. He can do alliance racing. He's just very flexible, and he can kind of adapt to your needs. His Landstrad popularity is very, very effective at stealing alliances. He's actually the most proficient alliance thief in the game. And he's just never a bad pick. He can be good in pretty much any position, and he'll always do okay for the most part. There's not a lot to say about Leto. He's just good. He has a faster route to Swordmaster than most leaders do, which is also a big advantage. He's vanilla, but he's vanilla in a fun way, and I don't mind the fact that he's vanilla. Okay, so that was Duke Leto. Now the next one. Now after this, things kind of get a lot more subjective. For me, things start to break down here when you talk about Rise of Ix or Immortality, because Rise of Ix is what's being played on the ranked ladder right now, and what I have the most experience with. I'm gonna mostly defer to Rise of Ix, but these rankings do change in Immortality, where leaders that have strong signet rings but weak passive abilities get weaker in Immortality because the experimentations compete for your agent icons with the rings. Um, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basics of it. I'm gonna say next in Reverend Mother tier. This is a good example, right? Helena is in my opinion, an A tier leader in Rise of Ix, but the consensus is that she becomes a weak leader with Immortality because of the way that the atomics tokens work. Um, Funny enough, I don't lose to Helena very often. Um, Usually, if I'm playing against a Helena, they lose. But when I'm playing Helena, I win like 75% of my games. It's kind of ridiculous. She's just such an effortlessly effective leader, in my opinion. You can always get the best cards available. You can reduce the card quality of your opponent's decks because you are taking the good cards away from them. Even if you can't afford the card with your ring, you can deny it to the other players, which can be important when certain players want certain cards, right? If there's a Sidina in the row, you can ring it to keep it away from Ariana, or a carry all to keep it away from Ariana, right? You can punish the weaker players or even the stronger players, right? If Baron has a mimic orders, you can take away the power play away from him, things like that. Um, Helena ends up probably with the strongest decks on average of any leader. Armand is kind of her competition there. And the longer the game goes, the more powerful she's going to be. She never gets screwed on Swordmaster timing. That's an area of the game that I think a lot of weaker players really struggle with, newer players as well, because it's one thing to get to 8 Solari, it's another thing to get to 8 Solari in time to get your Swordmaster before someone else does. It's really tricky, and even experienced players can be tripped up by it, because if somebody just throws out a windfall card or surprises you, then all of a sudden you may not get your Swordmaster, especially if you're in round position 3. You may not get your Swordmaster until round 6 if things don't go your way. So Helena is great because she can pretty much always get a Swordmaster by round 3 or 4 no matter what. And the ability to infiltrate High Council, the ability to infiltrate tech negotiation makes her good at technology. The ability to infiltrate research station makes her really good towards late game spice mist flows or Liet Kind strategies. She can infiltrate cities, so she's never locked out of combats. She's just a really good leader and a really easy leader, and I would recommend anyone that's getting into the game that wants to play with their friends that maybe have more experience than them, that they try Helena. That being said, like I said, she does get weaker in Immortality, and she's, I think, a situational leader. She is really good when she's good, like when the Kwisatz is in the row, or when the the Guild Accord or whatever is in the row. Helena's awesome, or the Gurney. But you're not going to pick Helena in a lot of situations if the row just isn't any good. Like if the row is crap, Helena is not gonna be doing a whole lot. Yeah, so you do want to make sure that you end up in a situation where deck building can be viable, which isn't always the case. But when you do pick her, I think she tends to perform very, very well, as long as you know when to pick her. So next up, originally I had Hundro in this tier, but more plays of the game, I've started to find Hundro running into a lot of issues. So I think I'm going to drop him down to Mentat tier, where I thought that Hundro was like sitting at the gates of the highest tier leaders. Right now, I don't feel like he can accomplish as much. Hundro's advantages are useful, but it's such a grab bag, and I don't feel like it slots into a lot of my playstyle very well. And I don't find myself losing to Hundro very often either. I still think he's good because the shipping track is so important, but the ability that he has, his intelligence ability, is really cool, but it doesn't pull its weight compared to other leaders' abilities, right? It's not anywhere near as good as Leto's passive ability or Helena's passive ability. Sure, you can high roll, right? You can get guild authorization and have round 1 shipping sometimes. That can happen, and then Hundro is fantastic. but a lot of the times your cards are going to be like tiebreaker and I don't know, expedite, and it's like, okay, well, I mean, I guess expedite's all right, but yeah, it's not going to build you the early game advantage that you need. And I think with Hundro, you really want to be snowballing with your intrigue card. There's some cool facets of like knowing what the top card of the deck is, so you can kind of get some information on other players, especially if you don't take the card yourself. But I think all in all, it doesn't add up to as much as I was expecting, and he does get a lot weaker in Ix because his ring competes really hard with the experimentation cards. Um, like you really want to play your experimentations, and if you're playing the ring, you're just not you're not always doing that. And he doesn't have a particularly faster path to Swordmaster besides through his ring, and it's not always possible that he can actually pull it off. So that's why I'm going to put Hundro in what we're going to call B tier here, Mentat. Ilban Ilban is kind of borderline. I think he could be in either of these. In Immortality, he's probably in Reverend Mother tier. In Rise of Ix, I'll put him in Reverend Mother tier. Ilban's a good leader. He doesn't look that good because his signet ring is kind of bad, right? Like one Solari, well, okay, but a Solari is worth less than a spice, and Memnon has that on his ring, and Ariana has a water, which is even more than a spice. So, why is Ilban good? And the reason that Ilban is good is because of his Ruthless Negotiator ability. Mentat drawing 2 cards is really powerful. And Swordmaster drawing you a card is also really powerful, as is the ability to do so at High Council. Sometimes you go to High Council and it's a tempo hit, and you're not getting anything that round, but that can help you get the Spice Must Flow more often, or the high cost card. And I think Ilban is also more flexible than a lot of the other deck building leaders. Like, Ilban can do anything. People don't always realize that, but he can go any directions. If you pick up a Worm Rider with Ilban, you can go into technologies, you can go into combats, you can do whatever. Card draw can help you with anything. And it's funny that I think Ilban ends up drawing more cards per game than Paul does, even though Paul is kind of supposed to be the card draw leader. So Ilban, I'm going to put him in Reverend Mother tier. He consistently can eke out victories, especially with games where a Holtzman engine comes out, or he ends up with a corner in the market or whatever. I tend to lose a decent number of games to Ilban. So I'm going to put Ilban in Reverend Mother tier. I guess next we should probably talk about Beast. Beast is probably the strongest of the remaining leaders in this sort of set here. He has the potential to be up here in Reverend Mother tier, but I find more consistently he's in sort of Mentat tier here with Hundro. Beast has a strong start with his extra resources, which can open him up a lot of different options. Beast has more flexibility with his opening round than anybody besides maybe Hundro, where you can go early Conspire, you can pick up, technologies faster than anyone else, particularly the 2-cost technologies. You have a faster Swordmaster from the Solari. The troops are going to be helpful all game, and Beast is one of those leaders just like Baron and Tessia, where he tries to race the game out very quickly with combat victories, sometimes with dreadnoughts, sometimes with technologies like Mimic Orders, but Beast just does it less effectively than Baron and Tessia do, although he can still be very strong. He's not a weak leader by any means. He's also very flexible. People think he's a combat-only leader, but really, you can use Beast to do almost anything if you can find an application for the Solari and the Spice. One of my recently uploaded videos was a game where I had Beast, I had Opulence, and I had Esmar Tuek. And the way that ended up working is I used the Solari to get an earlier Swordmaster, and I used the Spice to get an earlier Holtzman engine, and then just put the whole thing together. So you can definitely end up playing Beast, even like with deck building playstyles like my own. So you don't have to go full combat with him. Okay. Now, next, I'm going to say we kind of have a tie here. There's going to end up being a lot of leaders in this tier, I think, but we'll put... Gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, For me, of these leaders, the most successful is Armand. Um, Armand is very much a middle of the road leader. He tends to have about, I find I win about 50% of games with him, sometimes 45, 50% of games. He's the most fun leader. He's my favorite by a lot. But he needs a lot of things to get going. He needs low cost cards in the row that are worth grabbing, and he needs to get a decent synergy going or a good high cost card that he can trash down to. Armand also needs to get his Swordmaster quickly so that he can continue his trashes, and that's not always possible. In games where Armand doesn't get his Swordmaster, he can often fall off. But I will say that if Spy Satellites comes online, he can be the strongest leader in the game. He's a very, very effective Spy Satellites leader. So Armand is a lot of fun, but I do find that he tends to fall right in the middle of the pack in terms of actual power, particularly in Rise of Vix, where he's weaker than he is in Immortality, because in Immortality it's a more deck building oriented version of the game, and Armand shines a lot better there. Whereas in Rise of Ix, you just don't always, without the atomics tokens, you don't always end up getting cards that are worth trashing down to. Like if you have like two liaisons in your deck and like, I don't know, an Arrakis recruiter or something, you know, trashing your reconnaissance is okay, but it's not going to do that much. So I mean, Armand really does rely on the row to be useful. And then the other thing about Armand is he can high roll, but he can also have games where he doesn't draw his ring in his opening hand. He can't pick up that Sayadina or that In the Shadows, and then the whole reason you picked him is kind of out the window. But I will say, the one thing I'll say about Armand, the reason I do put him up here in Mentat tier is that the longer the game goes, the more inevitable an Armand victory becomes. If a game is going to round 9 and Armand is in that game, he's going to win. Just because no one else is going to be able to put together as much value as he will. He scales harder than every other leader. Helena is the only leader that really even comes close. So, yeah, I mean, in a lot of games, I mean, if you can play defense and prevent the higher tier leaders from closing the game out quickly, then Armand is going to be really powerful. And I think Armand's big problem is that he is weak to Tessia. He's weak to Baron. Because those leaders are going to want to end the game so quickly that Armand is not going to be able to do his thing. So that's kind of how Armand works. We'll keep going in Mentat here. We'll say probably Yuna next. Yuna is weird. I don't have a lot of success with her, but I have lost a decent number of games to her, so I feel like she's a leader that I'm just in a relative sense not as good with. She's got an interesting alternate playstyle from a lot of other leaders, where normally you value Solari very highly in the early game and then not at all in the late game, or very little in the late game, and you kind of transition to focusing on other resources. But Yuna kind of wants Solari all game long because her ring gives her a way to convert that Solari into something else meaningful. She has very quick Swordmaster timings, and it's even possible to get by round 2 your Swordmaster and your High Council seat with Yuna. It doesn't happen very often, but I do have games where I've done it, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. The problem is you'll get with this early Swordmaster and this early High Council, but then if you don't draft faction access, you can end up losing anyway, just because you're just kind of spinning your wheels and you don't have any points. She's good with Spy Satellites, just like Armand. I think the problem that Yuna runs into is that her abilities don't directly translate to points in any way, and that's the thing keeping her below leaders like Leto, leaders like Baron or Helena. So, and also I find for some reason whenever I'm playing Yuna, I end up with very bad deck building. I think that's because she doesn't start with a water, which means that she ends up being disadvantaged towards the research station and just generally not being able to access Hardy Warriors round 1. She kind of starts behind, and she's supposed to use her economy to pull ahead. And in some games that'll happen. If you get an Opulence or if you get a flagship, like, she's going to be very strong. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's just not in the cards for Yuna. So she's an interesting leader, but I almost would drop her a little bit here, but I'm not going to. Um, she's I have more success with Romber, but I lose more often to Yuna than Romber. So I'm going to put Yuna above Romber. Okay. Now down in Bashar tier here, I think is appropriate. We're going to go ahead and put Romber. Romber could go up to Mentat. He's a really fun leader. Should I put him up? Yeah, let's do that. Let's just put him up to Mentat. Well, but he's not as good as Beast. We'll put him at top of Bashar. He's kind of straddling the borderline. He is a um, medium to low strength leader that can be a lot of fun. The thing about Romber, he does people when the expansion first came out, people thought Romber was like the worst leader in the game. That's not true. It's just that his leader kind of tricks you. You look at it and it says like buy technologies and buy dreadnoughts, and then people proceeded to buy dreadnoughts and do really badly because dreadnoughts suck for the most part unless you can find an alternative way to get them online. The dreadnought space isn't any good, but his ring is good enough, especially if you're familiar with the tech deck, which is something that comes with time and experience, that he can still be really powerful. I have a lot of Romber wins posted on my channel where I did not buy a single dreadnought the entire game, just because his ring is so good. And now that being said, he's only working with like one leader ability, which is the reason why he's in Bashar tier and not like Reverend Mother tier. Um, yeah, but even still, he's pretty good if he can get going. And the one strength on dreadnoughts does help you at tie breaks with other dreadnoughts, right? If you're doing the thing where you try to go to third by putting a dreadnought in, your dreadnought's going to beat anyone else's dreadnought. And it can sometimes matter with combat victories, but on the margin, you'd rather just be beast and have more troops. Like having more troops is way better than having a dreadnought that the game doesn't give you that is slightly stronger. Yeah, it's just not balanced in that way. Romber, not a terrible leader. Probably like a 4 out of 10 leader. Overall, he's decent. He's okay. Next, we're gonna go ahead and put, I think, Aleza Ikaz. She's all right. She's very interesting. She's the most difficult leader to play in the game for sure, just because the one step ahead is so difficult to land, and her signet ring is very skill testing as well as to when you should use it. In Immortality, I think that she is like high Mentat tier. She's probably the leader that gets the biggest boost from Immortality out of any of these leaders, just because of the way grafting works. Grafting is extremely strong for Aleza. But in regular Rise of Ix, I find that her main advantage is getting technologies quickly, just because she makes a lot of spice. And sometimes she also can get a lot of Solari. But in general, it's easy to lock yourself out of your moves with this leader on accident or based on players taking moves you weren't expecting. Especially if you're going late in the turn order. The ring, while kind of cool, is just objectively one of the weakest rings in the game. It just doesn't provide a lot of value. A fold space is good, but, in the first half of the game, it's usually not worth the Solari. In the second half of the game, it is, but by that point, you may not draw them all that often, and you may have better cards anyway. So Aleza's cool, but she's difficult, I think is the right way to put it. A good Aleza player can play her at Mentat level, I think, or maybe even Reverend Mother level, but Aleza requires a lot of effort to be worse than Tessia with no effort, right? A beginner at the game can beat an expert at the game playing Tessia when the expert is playing Aleza, in my opinion. That's a bit of an overstatement, but it kind of brings the point that I'm trying to make here, where like the odds are significantly altered by those leader choices. Aleza's cool, she's fun, but she's also difficult. You kind of need good technologies to play her. Like if the opening row is like spaceport, sonic snoopers, I don't know, flagship, you're kind of not going to get a lot of value out of Aleza. in my opinion. Okay. Now these are the kind of the weak leaders. I actually initially I had Paul down here. I've been winning a lot of games with Paul. He really matches my playstyle, and I think he's a little bit underrated. So I am going to put him. I'm going to promote him up to Bashar tier. Now, don't. That being said, Paul is a weak leader. The reason Paul is weak is there's two reasons. First, on the digital application, you can always view the contents of your deck. So if you're familiar with probability, you can make informed guesses about what the top card of your deck is anyway. So it's not always providing a useful ability with his passive. It's a cool ability. It's fun. It's much more useful in paper than it is in a digital client. The other issue that Paul runs into is that sometimes that ability doesn't work at all. Like, it's kind of like Romber in that way. I mean, it's more consistently useful than Romber, but I rate Paul and Romber as about equal on strength. Like, okay, if your deck is empty, Paul's passive doesn't do anything. You're not allowed to shuffle your deck and look at the top card. There is no top card. You just don't get anything. And if you compare that to, Helena, her ability to infiltrate cities and land strat spaces is never just randomly turned off. Like, she's always going to use that ability. Whereas Paul's ability sometimes just doesn't do anything. It is cool, though. It's a fun ability. The other thing is his ring and his passive together don't make any resources at all, and they don't make any points. So you're going to have to use his deck building abilities, basically, to come up with resources and points. Now, if you buy an Esmar 2ek, right, like, you can get there, for sure, and Paul's reasonably good at getting 5-cost cards by round 1. But that's not always going to be possible. Sometimes the row doesn't cooperate with you. Sometimes you draw bad cards. Sometimes you build a good deck, but you just get outraced by another player, right? And so that's kind of the issue that Paul runs into. He's very much in the deck building lane, where if you compare him to Ilban, Ilban can go into sort of a combat specialty, or he can go into a spy satellites specialty, or he can go to alliances if things come out the right way for him. He's just a more flexible leader than Paul, whereas Paul really kind of has to play to deck building, and that's not always going to be possible. But I will say, the thing that Paul is good at, if you look at these top leaders, they generate resources or faction bumps in some way, right? Armand is sort of the exception, but Armand does deck building better than Paul does, because Armand jumpstarts the process faster with his ring and can actually trash cards, whereas Paul just kind of draws cards, and he has to spend more persuasion to get to the same point that Armand would have to do. That being said, Paul is better at getting mid-cost cards than Armand is, than a lot of other leaders are, actually. Like, if you see a good 5-cost card, Paul is actually quite good at snagging them, or 6-cost card even, because his ring provides him a lot of flexibility, and his passive ability lets him know what options are going to be fruitful and what aren't. Like, if you need to get 2 persuasion, and the top card of your deck is a dagger, you say, okay, going to Arianabros is not going to be sufficient unless I'm using my ring, right? Instead, I have to go to selective breeding, or I have to go to research station. So you can mold your plans around what will actually be fruitful, and that's kind of cool. So I like Paul a lot. He's one of my favorite leaders, but I will openly say that he is not amazing in Rise of X. I think he is better in Immortality, but to be honest, I have not played him a ton in Immortality, just a few times, and they've been pretty decent, so I would move him up in Immortality, but it's still a little preliminary, even, because I've just played like 3 or 4 times as many games of digital compared to the paper games with Immortality. Ariana is the worst leader in the game. It's not really close. I do pretty decent with Ariana because I've spent a lot of time playing her and a lot of time strategizing around her strengths, but she's just the worst leader in the game. It's not even super close. Paul has a leader ability that is helpful, but sometimes doesn't work. Ariana has a leader ability that is sometimes a penalty, right? Her ability to get technologies quickly is... okay. Her ability to get technologies quickly is worse than every other leader in the game because her ability to gather spice early is neutered, right? If you go to Imperial Basin, you get no spice at all. Hugga Basin gives you no spice at all. So, like, if there's a spy satellites or if there's a Holtzman engine or a shuttle fleet or whatever, Ariana is going to be worse than everyone else at getting there. Yeah. The card draw is cool. Adding 3 extra spaces to the map that draw cards is useful, and it makes Ariana good in a lot of deck building strategies. But in Rise of Ix, deck building is not the primary way that you win the game. I mean, it can be, right? That's how I play the game, and I win a decent amount. I even play leaders like Beast, leaders like Lido, leaders like Eliza in the deck building lane, even though they're not specialized towards that path. But yeah, I mean, overall, Ariana just doesn't have the juice. Her ring is good, and her ring opens up a lot of options, particularly around the research station and with repeat visits to Hardy Warriors. And when you play Ariana, if you want to win with her, you kind of have to think about how you're going to use her ring, right? Dominating combats with Hardy Warriors, or going to research station frequently. Getting a Kwisatz with a research station is one way you can do it. Getting a Jessica with a research station is one way you can do it. Or just, drawing cards too. I mean, the combination of her ring plus her ability to draw cards at spice spaces means that on average she probably draws more cards than anyone but Ilban, which is kind of cool. And in some games she'll draw more than Ilban, although not usually. But she's just too held back by her passive ability. And the other problem that she has is that she doesn't have any advantage towards getting Swordmaster quickly. In fact, she's actually a little bit worse at it, because you might say, okay, well, sure, she doesn't have any abilities to give Solari, but what if you go Conspire, right? You use her ring to get water, and then you go to what if you go smuggling with her ring, you get some Solari, you pick up some water, and then you go to grab 4 spice next round, and you try to go to Conspire and get an early Swordmaster. Well, the problem with that is that the spice space is going to have 4 spice on it, and you're only going to get 3. So you don't even have enough for Conspire. So one of the big problems with Ariana is that she's just harder. It's harder to get your Swordmaster with her than any other leader, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, it's not a huge disability, but it does end up mattering. I will say, though, I think she's significantly better in Immortality. In Immortality, she ends up being really good at research, because the water lets her go to the spice spaces with her experimentations more often. And then at the end of the research track, when she is able to play her experimentations to spice spaces and draw 2 cards, right? Imperial Basin, draw 2. That's pretty good. Like, that's a really good end game. So she's a more late game leader. She's in the same ballpark as like Armand and Paul and Helena. She gets better with Immortality also because she can use her ring to lock up a research station round 1, which allows her to potentially draw into like Stitched Horror or Scientific Breakthrough, or these other really powerful 3 Toalaxu block cards. I would say in Immortality, Ariana jumps up to Mentat tier, but in Ix, she's just the worst leader. Yeah, sorry. And then lastly, we have Memnon. Memnon's a little bit weird. I've had some really good games with Memnon where everything fell into place and worked perfectly, and then I've had a lot of... I've seen a lot of Memnons fall flat on their face, and I've fallen flat on my face with Memnon a few times as well. I think he probably... His ring is worse than Romber's ring, paradoxically, because Romber's ring, even though the spice is, bookmarked only to be used on technologies, Romber can use his ring to get multiple technologies and get them faster. The buying a technology opportunity is significant, and Romber's ability to use it, especially on combat spaces, is really notable, and Memnon just doesn't have that option. Memnon is better at getting to like selective breeding or Conspire, but his path to Swordmaster through Conspire is still pretty slow. If he goes like Signet Ring, Hug a Basin, Conspire, okay, sure, but you're only going to be getting Swordmaster round 3. It's not like all that impressive. That being said, his connections ability does allow him to potentially steal alliances in the mid and late game, and the ability to get spicy is really nice and handy. I would probably put Mimnon at the bottom of Bashar tier or at the top of Abomination tier. I think I'm going to put him at the bottom of Bashar because I feel like that is more accurate. I think he's tends to be weaker than Paul on average, even though he does provide resources. The problem with connections is just that the High Council seat, you probably you don't want to get High Council before Swordmaster, even if you're Memnon. Swordmaster is still more important, unless there's like a Kwisatz or Jessica in the row. Okay, and and so that's the first problem. And then in a lot of games, you don't get Swordmaster at all. Memnon will still usually get it most games, but that's not a guarantee. That's not a guarantee. So it really just depends. I mean, Connections is a fine ability, and the ring is decent, but I think it ends up not being incredibly powerful. I think Bashar is appropriate. He is better than Ariana, though. I've never lost a game to an Ariana before. I have lost game to Memnon before. So I'm going to go ahead and say this is the final ranking, ordered within tiers. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good day. And if you disagree with these picks, let me know. But I think that they're, for the most part, pretty accurate. At least for Rise of Vix. I think if we were gonna make a different tier list that was adjusted to like Immortality, we'd do like this, that, probably probably that. Maybe this. We'll do like that maybe. I don't know, something like that. If you were looking at Immortality. But overall, the original rankings I had, probably a little bit more accurate for the most part. And I have more experience with them. So anyway, thanks for listening, guys. And like I said, let me know what you think. I'll talk to you later.